To start this final plenary off, I'm going to invite our first speaker, and I'd just like to take the opportunity in inviting him, my successor as the chair of the Stop the War Coalition, to repeat what I said this morning. For every single one of us here, whatever party we're in, or however we vote, will wish Jeremy Corbyn every possible success in his campaign.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to everyone for their friendship, comradeship, knowledge and support for Stop the War and all the peace causes that we have. It's barely credible to think that we started Stop the War Coalition in 2001 when there was a threat of the invasion of Afghanistan. 3,000 people turned up to that founding meeting. None of us who organised that event ever thought that 14 years later we would now become a very large part of the peace movement in this country, very important factor on the whole peace landscape across the world, and here as a permanent fixture, because it appears that the war on terror has also become a permanent fixture. So as long as the war on terror goes on, as long as the wars go on, and we will not give up. Is that okay? And when we had that founding meeting, I recall very well what Bruce Kent said about one war leads to another, and one war leads to another, which leads to more victims, and more victims lead to another war, and so it goes on. The ultimate victims of those wars are what? Afghan refugees dying in the sea, trying to get to Indonesia or Australia to be sent to some offshore island where they'll be processed and imprisoned for having the temerity to seek asylum in Australia. People that have managed to travel all around the Middle East, escaping from Iraq or Syria or Lebanon, wherever the war happens to be, or Palestine, managed to get to Libya, a totally dysfunctional country thanks to Western bombing of it. And then they try and travel on leaky, dangerous vessels across the Mediterranean. And eventually, well done the Italian Navy for Operation Nostrum to defend people. Well done them. They tried very hard and they did save a lot of lives. They were then told by the European Union the priority was protecting Europe's borders from these people. So they set up a defence force to keep the migrants away. Fortunately, eventually there was such a level of shame that there's now some sort of search and rescue operation going on. But in Parliament this week, when we raised this matter with David Cameron, what does he say? We've got to be very careful. Some of these people are migrants. And some of these people want to stay. And therefore, we will pluck them out of the water, dry them off, and send them back. Sorry, those people are victims, in part, of wars that we have created when we bombed Afghanistan and bombed Iraq. Because that is the reality of what war actually does. And again, this week in Parliament, Tory MP after Tory MP got up and said, we've got a big navy, we've got a big air force, we've got nuclear weapons, we've got a big army, we can do it. We might be one of the sort of smaller countries in the world with a population of 65 million, but we're the fourth biggest arms spender in the world. Let's get higher up that league and spend even more. We spend 2% of our gross national income on defence. That amounts to well over £35 billion per year. The same people are proposing to spend £100 billion on the replacement of the Trident nuclear missile system in 2016, on the grounds it gives us security. Well, I watched this security notion in operation 2 weeks ago. I went to the United Nations for the last 2 days of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty discussions. The 5 declared nuclear weapon states were all declaring they needed nuclear weapons for their security. Meanwhile, the rest of the world must not have them because they would be insecure. The 5 would feel insecure if the other 185 decided their security depended on the same level of security. Are you all with me now? You're still with me? Good. Very smart audience, I gather that. And then when we got to the question of a Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone, very carefully worded document. 15 years ago, the idea was mooted of a weapons mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East, which would include a conference, which would include Israel and Iran. Iran is a signatory to the NPT, Israel is not, but this conference would include all those parties. This conference has been agreed at every PrepCon, which happens every year, and every review conference. It's already agreed at 3 review conferences. It's never been held. Now, why has it never been held? Is it because Iran is not prepared to negotiate? Obviously not. There's been nothing but negotiations with Iran for the past 5 years. And don't get me wrong, I welcome that. Talking and negotiating is far better than threatening and going to war. But it still hasn't been held. So Israel, it's okay for them to have nuclear weapons. But I tell you this, if that conference isn't held, if disarmament doesn't take place across the Middle East, then there's some very wealthy countries there that can afford to buy and develop their own nuclear weapons technology and start a new nuclear weapons race in that region. It is that dangerous. That is why, in Stop the War, we're not only against wars of occupation that have been undertaken by this country, we're also absolutely in support of the campaign for non-replacement of Trident and the ending of Britain's nuclear weapons capability as an example to the rest of the world. That surely has to be the direction in which we go. Now, I can see Andrew becoming slightly nervous, so I'll just say this in conclusion. We spend all this money through NATO, and NATO has become almost a world organisation. And it has enormous influence on political organisations all around the world. The US are pushing for higher and higher levels of expenditure. And as a result of that, what do we get? A big arms industry, lots of wars, and arms fairs all over the world to promote more wars. We all have differences of opinion with lots of people. None of us are in favour of what ISIS are doing or many other groups such as that. But those groups don't come from nowhere. The situation that gives rise to those groups doesn't come from nowhere. If we, in our arrogance, decide that the only solution to every conflict around the world is for Western troops to go in, bomb, destroy, and occupy, then there is a payback, and that payback is the next war and more deaths. We pay a price ourselves in the damage and loss to our own civil liberties. Obviously, we pay a damage to ourselves in the expenditure on weapons that is undertaken by Britain and other Western countries. So we'll be on the anti-austerity march on June the 20th. Because if the choice is health, education, housing, ending the ghastly inequality of wealth in Britain today, and the shortage of housing and all the other issues, or spending $100 billion on Trident and more aircraft carriers, more tanks and more missiles, I know what choice I want to make. You know what choice you want to make. Let's make that choice on June the 20th. Stop the War Coalition is here to unite people. We might not all agree on everything. We never will. That's not the point. The point is we're marching down the same road for a world based on peace and justice and sharing resources rather than grabbing resources and denying people justice in the process. The world does not have to be so divided. People don't have to be so poor. Migrants don't have to die at sea. We need a different political agenda to bring that about. Thank you very much.
Just said at the end of that speech, we had a demonstration on June the 20th, which perhaps is the first opportunity to take forward some of the demands expressed at this conference for peace and justice around the world, allied to the campaign against austerity here at home.